The train from Oslo cut through the November darkness like a blade through black velvet, carrying Detective Liv Halvorsen toward what she hoped would be her redemption. Outside the frosted window, Norway's endless forests pressed against the tracks, ancient spruces standing like silent witnesses to centuries of secrets. She pressed her fingertips against the cold glass, watching her reflection overlay the passing landscape, a ghost of herself superimposed on a world that had already judged her. The folder on her lap contained 3 cases, each one a wound in the local community's collective memory. 3 disappearances over 18 months in the Østerdalen Valley, a region where everyone knew everyone, where family names stretched back generations, and where silence was often more valued than truth. The Oslo Police Department had given up after 6 months of investigation, yielded nothing but dead ends and hostile locals. Now, 2 years later, Liv had specifically requested the transfer to Elvstad, the small town at the heart of the disappearances. Her phone buzzed with a text from her former partner Christian. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Liv. The Bergman case wasn't your fault." She deleted it without responding. The Bergman case was absolutely her fault. A rushed judgment, a misread situation, and a young woman had paid the price. The official inquiry had cleared her of legal wrongdoing, but the court of public opinion had been less forgiving. The newspapers had been particularly cruel, using her photo alongside headlines about police incompetence. The train slowed as it approached Elvestad station, a modest wooden structure that looked unchanged since the 1950s. Through the window, she could see a man standing on the platform, collar turned up against the wind, a press badge visible even from a distance. Erik Nordahl, the journalist who'd been covering the disappearances since his sister Astrid became the second victim. His emails had been part of what drew her to these cases, filled with observations the original investigators had dismissed as conspiracy theories. Liv gathered her belongings and stepped onto the platform, the cold air hitting her lungs like a shock. Erik approached with measured steps, his face carrying the weathered look of someone who'd aged a decade in 2 years. His handshake was firm but brief, his eyes studying her with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read people like evidence. "Detective Halvorsen," he said, his voice carrying a slight rasp. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come. Most officers from Oslo last about a week here before deciding we're all paranoid provincials." "I'm not most officers," Liv replied, pulling her coat tighter. "And I've read your articles. You're anything but paranoid. Persistent, maybe. Obsessive, definitely. But not paranoid." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Obsessive, that's what my editor calls it too, before he stopped publishing my pieces about Astrid and the others." He gestured toward an old Volvo parked nearby. "Come on, I'll drive you to the boarding house. Tomorrow I'll show you what the original investigation missed." The drive through Elvestad revealed a town caught between centuries. Traditional wooden houses with intricate carved details stood alongside modern convenience stores, their neon signs garish against the muted November palette. The mountains loomed on all sides, creating a valley that felt more like a bowl, contained and separate from the outside world. Liv noticed how few people were on the streets, despite it being only 7 in the evening. "The first one was Maya Lindberg," Erik said, breaking the silence. 17 years old. Worked at her family's bakery. Left for her evening run on September 15th, 1998. Her usual route took her along the forest trail that connects the town to the old church. They found her running shoes at the trailhead, placed neatly side by side, like she'd just stepped out of them. Liv had read the file, but hearing it from someone who knew the victim added weight to the facts. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, despite it being daylight. "That's what makes no sense," Erik said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "That trail is popular with dog walkers, elderly couples, teenagers looking for privacy. Someone should have seen something, but everyone claims they stayed home that particular evening. All of them." The boarding house was a three-story building that had seen better decades, run by an elderly woman named Ingrid, who eyed Liv with suspicion barely disguised as hospitality. The room was sparse but clean, with a view of the forest that seemed to press against the window. Liv unpacked methodically, arranging the case files on the small desk, creating her own incident board with photos and string she'd brought from Oslo. That night, she studied the patterns, or rather, the absence of patterns. Maya Lindberg, 17, disappeared while jogging. Astrid Nordahl, 23, vanished walking home from her shift at the local medical clinic. Torbjörn Haugen, 41, a forestry worker, never returned from what should have been a routine timber survey. 3 different ages, genders, occupations. No connections except geography and the complete absence of evidence. A knock at her door interrupted her concentration. Eric stood in the hallway looking haggard. "I know it's late, but there's someone you need to meet. Someone who wouldn't talk to the other investigators." They drove through empty streets to the edge of town, where the last houses gave way to forest. An old cabin stood alone, smoke rising from its chimney. Inside, an elderly man sat by the fire, his face carved with lines that seemed to map decades of harsh winters. Olav Björnsson had been the town's unofficial historian for 60 years, keeper of stories that predated written records. "Another detective from the city," Olav said, not looking up from the fire. "Come to tell us how we're hiding something, how we're protecting someone." "Actually," Liv said, taking the seat Eric offered, "I've come to listen. To understand why 3 people could vanish without anyone seeing anything, without anyone knowing anything." Olav's eyes finally met hers, sharp despite his age. "What makes you think no one saw anything? What makes you think no one knows?" The fire crackled as silence stretched between them. Finally, Olav spoke again, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "This valley has its own ways, detective, always has. We don't involve outsiders in our problems. We handle things ourselves. But sometimes things happen that can't be handled, things that can only be endured." "Are you saying the community knows what happened to these people?" Liv asked carefully. "I'm saying that knowledge and acknowledgement are different things," Olav replied. "There are things that everyone knows but no one says, truths that would destroy more lives than they would save. The investigators before you, they looked for evidence of crimes. But what if there were no crimes? What if there were only choices?" Eric leaned forward, his journalist's instincts activated. Choices? Astrid didn't choose to disappear. She had plans, dreams. She was applying to medical school. Olav's gaze turned to Eric with something like pity. "How well do we really know anyone? How well did you know your sister? Did you know about her visits to the old Holmsen farm? Did you know about the meetings in the forest, the old traditions some still follow?" The room felt smaller suddenly, the fire's warmth oppressive. Liv watched Eric's face cycle through confusion, anger, and something like fear. This was new information, even to him. "What traditions?" Liv asked. Olav stood, moving to an old chest in the corner. He pulled out a worn leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. "Every place has its old ways, detective. Some places just remember them better, or worse, depending on your perspective." He handed her the journal. "This belonged to my grandmother. She documented the old practices, the ones the church tried to stamp out but never quite succeeded in killing. Read it, then decide if you really want to find your answers." As they left, Eric was silent until they reached the car. "I've lived here my whole life," he said quietly. "I thought I knew this place, these people, but Olav's right about one thing. Astrid was going somewhere in the weeks before she disappeared. She said it was extra shifts at the clinic, but now I'm not sure." Liv clutched the journal, feeling the weight of secrets in its pages. The forest around them seemed alive with watching eyes, and she wondered if the original investigators had been wrong about everything. Maybe the community wasn't protecting a killer. Maybe they were protecting themselves from a truth that was worse than murder. Back in her room, she opened the journal, reading by lamplight as wind rattled the windows. The entries spoke of rituals tied to the seasons, to the forest, to maintaining balance between the human world and something older. Not supernatural, but deeply psychological, traditions that bound the community in ways outsiders could never understand. The last entry, dated 1953, ended with a warning. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some prices, once paid, can never be refunded. The forest remembers all debts. The morning arrived, wrapped in fog so thick that the world beyond Liv's window had ceased to exist. She'd spent the night reading Olaf's grandmother's journal, each page revealing layers of local tradition that went deeper than folklore. These weren't fairy tales meant to frighten children, but detailed accounts of communal rituals, seasonal gatherings, and most disturbingly something called the choosing, which occurred every generation when the community faced crisis. Eric met her at the small police station that served Elvestad and 3 neighboring villages. The sole officer on duty, Constable Magnus Eriksson, was a man in his 50s who seemed to have perfected the art of being present while absent. He greeted Liv with professional courtesy, but offered no assistance beyond showing her to a cramped office that smelled of decades of cigarette smoke. "The original case files are in those boxes," Magnus said, gesturing to a corner. "Though I doubt you'll find anything the Oslo team missed. They were very thorough." After he left, Eric laughed bitterly. Thorough. They spent most of their time at the hotel bar, complaining about the locals being uncooperative. Magnus made sure of that, scheduling interviews when people were working, losing messages, misfiling reports. Liv pulled out the files, spreading them across the desk. "Tell me about the Holmsen farm." The place Olaf mentioned. Eric's expression darkened. Abandoned for 20 years. The family left suddenly one winter, just packed up and disappeared. No one bought the property. No one goes there, except apparently my sister did. They drove out to the farm that afternoon, following a dirt road that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The forest pressed close on both sides, branches scraping the car like fingers, trying to hold them back. The farmhouse, when it finally appeared, was a skeleton of its former self, weathered to grey, windows dark and empty. But the barn behind it stood intact. Its red paint faded, but somehow defiant against time. Inside the barn they found evidence of recent use. Candles arranged in circles, dried herbs hanging from rafters, and most significantly personal items that made Eric go rigid beside her. A scarf he recognized as Astrid's, a work glove that could have belonged to Torbjörn, a hair tie that might have been Maya's. "This isn't a crime scene," Liv said quietly, studying the arrangement. "This is a memorial." They photographed everything before heading back to town. Eric drove in silence, processing what they'd found. Finally, he spoke. "Astrid was seeing someone. She never told me who, said I wouldn't understand. I assumed it was someone married, someone inappropriate. But what if it was about this? What if she was involved in whatever this is?" That evening, Liv visited the families of the missing. The Lindbergs ran their bakery with mechanical precision, their grief calcified into routine. When she asked about Maya's state of mind before the disappearance, Mrs. Lindberg's face closed like a door. "Maya was a good girl," she said firmly. "Whatever you're implying, you're wrong." But Mr. Lindberg, when his wife went to serve a customer, leaned closer. She'd been asking questions about her grandmother, about the old days. Found some letters in the attic. She wanted to know about the choosing, but we told her it was just old superstition. Maybe we should have told her the truth. "What truth?" Liv pressed. He shook his head. "That some superstitions are based on real events. That sometimes a community survives by making impossible choices. The Haugen house was different. Torbjörn's wife, Solveig, met Liv with resignation rather than resistance. "I knew someone would come eventually," she said, serving coffee with steady hands. "Someone who would actually look instead of just see." She led Liv to Torbjörn's study, where maps of the forest covered every wall, marked with symbols Liv recognized from the journal. "My husband wasn't just a forestry worker," Solveig explained. He was documenting the old paths, the sacred sites. He believed the community had forgotten something essential, something that was causing an imbalance. What kind of imbalance? Solveig hesitated, then pulled out a folder of newspaper clippings. Local stories spanning 50 years, unusual weather patterns, failed harvests, livestock diseases, and periodic disappearances that were explained away as accidents or people leaving town. Every generation, when things get bad enough, the choosing happens. 3 people volunteer to restore the balance. They go into the forest to the old places and they don't come back. Volunteer? Liv felt cold despite the warm room. Are you saying Torbjörn chose to disappear? I'm saying he felt responsible. The year before he vanished, his timber crew accidentally destroyed one of the old sites. After that, things started going wrong. Businesses failing, young people leaving, a darkness settling over the town. He believed he could fix it. That night, Liv met Eric at the town's only bar. The locals gave them a wide berth, conversations dying as they passed. They found a corner table and Liv shared what she'd learned. Eric listened, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally, a terrible understanding. Astrid was always the responsible one, he said quietly. Always trying to fix things, help people. If she believed the town was suffering because of something, if she thought she could help by participating in some ritual, he couldn't finish the sentence. We need to find someone who knows the actual ritual, Liv said. Not the stories about it, but the real practice. Eric thought for a moment. There's someone. Astrid mentioned her once, said she was helping with historical research. Ragnhild Voss lives up the mountain, but she doesn't talk to outsiders. Then we'll have to convince her we're not outsiders anymore. The next morning brought snow, the first of the season, transforming the landscape into something even more isolated. They drove up the mountain road carefully, Eric pointing out landmarks mentioned in the journal. The Voss house was old but well-maintained, smoke rising from 2 chimneys, suggesting warmth and life within. Ragnhild Voss answered the door herself, a woman in her 70s with eyes that seemed to see through pretense. She studied Liv for a long moment before speaking. You're the detective from Oslo, the one who made a mistake. Liv felt exposed, but didn't flinch. Yes. Good, Ragnhild said, stepping aside. People who've made mistakes understand that sometimes there are no good choices. Come in. The house was filled with books, photographs, and artifacts that belonged in a museum. Ragnhild served them tea in a room where every surface held history. You want to know about the choosing, she said. It wasn't a question. I want to know what happened to the missing people, Liv corrected. Ragnhild smiled sadly. Same thing. Detective, every community has its founding myths. Ours happens to be true. 200 years ago, this valley faced starvation. Winter came early, stayed late. The community made a bargain. What kind of bargain? The kind that can't be broken. 3 souls for the valley's survival. Not a sacrifice to gods or spirits, but to the land itself, to the balance between human ambition and natural order. It worked. The valley prospered, but the price comes due every generation when the balance tips too far. Eric set down his cup with shaking hands. You're saying Astrid believed this? That she voluntarily walked into the forest to die? Not to die, Ragnhild corrected, to transform, to become part of the forest itself, guardians of the balance. It's not death, as you understand it. Liv felt her investigator's instincts warring with the impossibility of what she was hearing. Where do they go? There must be bodies. Evidence. Ragnhild stood, moving to a window that overlooked the forest. There's a place deep in the woods, a grove that's been sacred since before Christianity came to Norway. The old maps don't show it. GPS doesn't work there. The chosen ones go there, and they remain there, alive but changed. That's not possible, Liv said flatly. Isn't it? Ragnhild turned back to them. Detective, you came here looking for a crime. But what if there was no crime? What if 3 people facing their own demons and their communities suffering chose to believe in something larger than themselves? What if their families, understanding this choice, chose to protect their decision with silence? The room felt suffocating suddenly. Everything Liv had learned about investigation, about evidence and logic, was being challenged not by supernatural claims, but by the possibility of collective conviction so strong it could make people disappear willingly. "Show us," Eric said suddenly. "Show us this grove." Ragnhild studied him for a long moment. "You're not ready for that truth, neither of you. But I'll tell you this. Your sister left a message. For you specifically, Eric." She retrieved a sealed envelope from a desk drawer, handed it to Eric. His name was written on it in Astrid's handwriting. He tore it open with trembling fingers, read it silently, then passed it to Liv. "Eric, if you're reading this, it means you didn't accept the easy answers. I can't explain everything, but know this. I chose. Not because I had to, but because I understood what was at stake. The town is sick, has been getting sicker for years. The young leave, the old die without passing on their knowledge, and something essential is being lost. I found a way to help heal it. Don't grieve for me. I'm not gone, just transformed. Look for me in the forest's whispers, in the town's gradual healing. I love you. Astrid." The letter changed everything and nothing. Eric spent 3 days in his apartment, not answering calls, while Liv dove deeper into the investigation with a fervor that bordered on obsession. She interviewed 37 residents, each conversation revealing another thread in the tapestry of communal silence. The stories were consistent in their vagueness, their careful omissions speaking louder than words. On the 4th day, Magnus the constable appeared at her boarding house room at dawn. "There's been a development," he said, his usual practiced indifference cracked with something like fear. "Someone's come back." The hospital in the neighboring town was a 40-minute drive through roads made treacherous by fresh snow. Liv found Eric already there, standing outside a patient room, his face pale with shock. Through the window, she could see Torbjörn Haugen lying in the bed, alive but changed. He'd lost significant weight, his hair had gone completely white despite being only 41, and his eyes held a distance that suggested he was seeing something beyond the sterile hospital walls. "He walked out of the forest this morning," the doctor explained, clearly skeptical of the story he'd been told. "Hypothermic, malnourished, but somehow alive after 2 years. He keeps saying he needs to deliver a message, that the choosing failed." They were allowed 10 minutes with him. Torbjörn's voice was hoarse, as if he'd forgotten how to use it. "The grove," he said, gripping Liv's hand with surprising strength. "We went to the grove, all 3 of us, Maya, Astrid and me. We performed the ritual, offered ourselves to restore the balance, but something went wrong." "What ritual?" Liv asked gently, aware of the recording device in her pocket. "The binding. We were supposed to become guardians, tied to the land, maintaining the harmony between human and nature. My grandmother did it in 1952, her grandfather in 1903. It's real, detective, more real than anything else in this modern world. But this time, the forest rejected us." Eric leaned forward, desperate. "Where's Astrid? Where's my sister?" Torbjörn's eyes filled with tears. "Still there, still trying. Maya gave up after the first winter, walked deeper into the forest and never came back. Astrid stayed with me, convinced we could complete the ritual. But last week she told me to go, to warn everyone. The balance isn't being restored. It's getting worse." The medical staff intervened then, insisting Torbjörn needed rest. As they left, Liv noticed men in suits in the lobby, government types from Oslo. The story of a man returning after 2 years missing had attracted attention beyond the local authorities. Outside, Eric was shaking, whether from cold or emotion, Liv couldn't tell. "He's traumatized," she said carefully. "People under extreme stress can believe—" "Stop," Eric interrupted. "Just stop. I know what you're thinking, what any rational person would think. But you've read the journal, seen the evidence. What if the impossible explanation is the true one?" That afternoon, Solveig Haugen agreed to speak with them again. She seemed unsurprised by her husband's return, as if she'd been expecting it. "He left me a letter too," she admitted, explaining what he planned to do. "I burned it. Couldn't bear for anyone to think he was insane, but I knew. The signs were all there that year. The salmon didn't run, the berries didn't grow, even the tourists stopped coming. The town was dying." "And you believed this ritual could fix that?" Liv asked. "I believed my husband believed it," Solveig said. "And sometimes belief is enough. Look outside, detective. Since they disappeared, things have been getting better. Businesses recovering, young families moving back, until last month when it all started reversing again." Liv checked the economic data that evening. Solveig was right. The period immediately following the disappearances had seen a marked improvement in local conditions, statistically significant enough to rule out coincidence. But recent months showed a sharp decline, worse than before. She called her former partner in Oslo, asking him to research similar patterns in other remote communities. What he found sent chills down her spine. Every region with documented choosing traditions showed similar cycles: decline, disappearances, recovery, eventual decline again. The pattern stretched back centuries, too consistent to be mere folklore. Erik arrived at her room near midnight, bringing Ragnhild Voss with him. The elderly woman looked grim. "Torbjörn's return changes everything," she said. "If the choosing failed, if the forest rejected them, then we're facing something unprecedented. The old balance is broken and we don't know how to fix it. There has to be a rational explanation," Liv insisted, though her conviction was weakening. Ragnhild pulled out a map, hand-drawn and ancient. "Tomorrow night is the winter solstice. If Astrid is still alive, still in the grove, this is when she'll try one last time to complete the ritual. We can go there, see for ourselves. But once you know the truth, detective, you can't unknow it." The next day passed in tense preparation. Liv informed Magnus she was following a lead, but didn't specify what. She could tell he knew anyway. The whole town seemed to know. People watched from windows as they prepared, some with hope, others with fear. As darkness fell on the shortest day of the year, they set out, Liv, Erik and Ragnhild, with Torbjörn insisting on joining despite his weakness. The path into the forest wasn't on any map, but Torbjörn led them unerringly, as if pulled by invisible threads. The temperature dropped steadily as they went deeper, their flashlights seeming to barely penetrate the darkness between the ancient trees. After 2 hours of hiking, the forest suddenly opened into a grove that shouldn't exist. The trees here were impossibly old, their trunks wider than buildings, their branches forming a natural cathedral. In the center, a figure sat by a small fire. Astrid Nordahl, alive but transformed like her companion had been. Her hair was white, her skin pale as moonlight, her eyes reflecting the fire with an unusual gleam. Erik ran to her, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't come closer," she said, her voice carrying an odd resonance. "I'm between worlds now, neither fully here nor there." "Astrid, please," Erik begged, "come home. Whatever you think you're doing, it's not worth this." She smiled sadly. "You still don't understand. The choosing isn't superstition, Erik. It's an agreement, generations old. We offer ourselves as bridges between the human and natural worlds, maintaining a balance that keeps both alive. But something's changed. The forest no longer trusts humanity. We've taken too much, ignored too many warnings." Liv stepped forward, her investigative instincts still fighting against what she was witnessing. "Where's Maya?" Astrid gestured to the trees around them. "She succeeded where we failed. She's part of the forest now, truly part of it. I can hear her sometimes, in the wind, through the leaves. She's at peace." "That's not possible," Liv said, but even as she spoke, she noticed something. The trees nearest to them seemed to lean in, as if listening. The fire flickered in patterns that matched no wind she could feel. "Detective Halvorsen," Astrid said, looking directly at her, "you came here seeking redemption for your mistake in Oslo, but some mistakes can't be fixed by solving other puzzles. Some truths can't be proven with evidence. The choosing has failed because we've lost the ability to truly sacrifice, to give without taking. The forest knows our hearts aren't pure anymore. Torbjörn collapsed then, his strength finally giving out. As they rushed to help him, Astrid stood and walked toward the largest tree, placing her hand on its bark. "I'm staying," she announced, "not because of tradition or obligation, but because someone needs to keep trying. Someone needs to prove that humans can still choose harmony over dominance." "No!" Eric lunged for her, but she stepped into the tree itself, her form seeming to merge with the bark. For a moment, Liv saw something impossible. Astrid's face in the tree's surface, peaceful and resolved. Then it was gone, leaving only bark and shadow. They carried Torbjörn out of the forest in shocked silence. He died 3 days later in the hospital, his last words a warning about the balance being beyond repair. The government officials from Oslo closed the case, classifying it as mass hysteria brought on by isolation and local superstition. Maya Lindberg and Astrid Nordahl were officially declared dead, their disappearances attributed to the harsh wilderness. But Liv knew differently. She'd seen the truth, even if she could never prove it. The choosing was real, had been real for generations. But something fundamental had broken in the relationship between humanity and nature, something that no amount of sacrifice could repair anymore. She returned to Oslo a week later, carrying the weight of impossible knowledge. Eric stayed in Elvestad, visiting the grove daily, claiming he could sometimes hear his sister's voice in the wind. The town continued its decline, businesses closing, families moving away, as if the land itself was rejecting human presence. 3 months after returning to Oslo, Liv received a call that shattered her attempted return to normalcy. Elvstad was being evacuated. A massive landslide had destabilized the mountain above the town, and geologists were predicting complete collapse within days. The news reports called it a natural disaster, blamed on unusual spring rainfall and decades of deforestation. But Liv knew better. She drove through the night, arriving to find the town in chaos. Emergency vehicles lined the streets, residents loading their lives into trucks and cars. Eric found her at the police station, where Magnus was coordinating the evacuation with grim efficiency. "It started the day after the spring equinox," Eric explained, exhausted from helping families pack. "Small tremors at first, then cracks appearing in the mountain. The scientists say it's geological instability, but the old-timers know the land is rejecting us." Magnus overheard and laughed bitterly. 40 years I've kept the peace here, maintained the silence about the choosing, and for what? The mountain is going to bury it all anyway." That evening, as the evacuation continued, Ragnhild Voss appeared at the emergency center. Despite her age, she moved with purpose, carrying an ancient leather satchel. "There's one last thing to try," she announced to Liv, Eric, and a gathering of town elders. "The oldest records speak of a dissolution ritual, a way to release the community from the bargain, but it requires someone who stands between worlds." "Astrid," Eric said immediately. "She's still in the grove, still connected." Ragnhild nodded. "But also someone from outside who's witnessed the truth, someone who carries their own burden of failure." Her eyes fixed on Liv. The group that entered the forest that night was larger than before. Liv, Eric, Ragnhild, and 7 town elders who remembered the last successful choosing 2 generations ago. The forest felt different, angry. Trees that had stood for centuries groaned ominously, and the ground occasionally shuddered beneath their feet. The grove, when they reached it, was transformed. The ancient trees showed signs of disease, their leaves black despite the spring season. The tree where Astrid had disappeared bore a vertical crack down its center, weeping a dark sap that smelled of decay. "She's still here," Eric said, placing his hand on the cracked bark. "I can feel her." Ragnhild opened her satchel, revealing artifacts older than the town itself, carved stones, pressed flowers that somehow retained their color, and a knife made from a metal that didn't reflect light normally. She began speaking in a dialect of Norwegian so old that Liv could only understand fragments. As the ritual progressed, the grove began to change. The darkness between the trees deepened, and shapes moved within it, not threatening, but watching, waiting. The crack in Astrid's tree widened, and suddenly she was there, stepping out as if from behind a curtain. But she wasn't alone. Maya Lindberg emerged from another tree, looking exactly as she had the day she disappeared, 17 and wearing her running clothes. From the shadows came others, people Liv recognized from old photographs in the town museum, the chosen ones from generations past, all present, all waiting. "You want to break the bargain," Astrid said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the trees themselves. "But you don't understand what you're asking. We are the barrier between worlds. Without us, without the choosing, the separation dissolves. The town is dying anyway," Eric argued. "The mountain is collapsing. What difference does it make?" Maya spoke for the first time, her young voice carrying ancient wisdom. "The town was always meant to be temporary. Human settlements rise and fall. But the bargain kept the damage contained, local. Break it, and the imbalance spreads." Liv stepped forward, her detective's mind still trying to process the impossible. "What if there's another way? What if instead of human sacrifice or dissolution, we find a new balance? The world has changed. Maybe the bargain needs to change too." The grove fell silent. Even the wind stopped. Then, one of the elder chosen ones, a woman in clothing from the 1800s, laughed. "An outsider proposes evolution over tradition. How very modern." "But she's not wrong," Astrid said thoughtfully. "The old ways assumed humans and nature were separate, requiring bridges. But what if they're not? What if the problem is the belief in separation itself?" Ragnhild, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke. "There's precedent. In the very oldest stories, before the choosing, there was the knowing. Humans who understood they were nature, not separate from it. The choosing was always a compromise, a way to maintain connection after the knowing was lost." The ground shuddered violently, reminding them of the urgency. The mountain above Elvestad was running out of time. "I'll do it," Liv said suddenly. "Whatever needs to be done to save the town, to evolve the bargain. I'll do it." "It's not about sacrifice anymore," Astrid said gently. "It's about understanding. You carry guilt from Oslo, from the Bergman case. You think finding truth here will redeem that failure. But redemption isn't found in solving mysteries. It's found in accepting that some things can't be solved, only transformed." The ritual that followed was unlike anything in Ragnhild's ancient texts. It wasn't about offering lives to the forest, but about dissolving the barriers between human consciousness and natural awareness. Liv felt her perception expanding, suddenly aware of every root beneath the soil, every creature in the darkness, every drop of water moving through the mountain. She understood then what had gone wrong. The choosing had tried to maintain balance through sacrifice, but balance isn't static. It's a constant dance, a continuous negotiation. The town's founders had tried to fix their relationship with nature through ritual, but relationships can't be fixed in place. They must grow or die. "The evacuation," she gasped, coming back to herself. "It's not a failure. It's the solution. The town needs to disperse, spread out, integrate with the larger world instead of hiding in this valley. The concentration is what breaks the balance." Eric looked stricken. "Leave Elvestad. Let it die? Let it transform," Astrid corrected. "Some will leave, carrying the knowledge with them. Others will stay, but differently. Not as a closed community keeping ancient secrets, but as guardians who understand that everywhere is sacred, not just hidden groves." The chosen ones began to fade, not disappearing but dispersing, their essence spreading through the forest and beyond. Astrid lingered longest, holding her brother's hand one last time. "Will I see you again?" Eric asked. "You'll see me everywhere," she replied. "In every tree, every mountain stream, every moment you remember that you're not separate from the world but part of it. The choosing is ending, but the knowing is returning." She released his hand and stepped back into the tree, but this time the tree didn't contain her. Instead, Liv could feel her presence spreading through the entire forest, becoming part of the living network that connected every growing thing. They returned to find the evacuation nearly complete. The government had already decided to designate the valley a nature reserve after the landslide settled, inadvertently ensuring that the land would remain protected. The residents of Elvestad would scatter across Norway and beyond, but they would carry with them a different understanding of their place in the world. Eric published his story a year later, not as journalism but as fiction. No one would have believed the truth anyway. He described it as an allegory about environmental destruction and community dissolution, winning literary prizes for its metaphorical depth. Only a few readers noticed the dedication to Astrid, who chose to become the forest. Liv returned to her work in Oslo, but she was changed. She solved cases differently now, understanding that not every mystery needed to be unraveled, that some truths were better left transformed than exposed. The Bergman case still haunted her, but differently. She understood now that her mistake hadn't been in misreading evidence, but in believing that evidence could capture the full truth of human experience. On the anniversary of the evacuation, she returned to what had been Elvstad. The town was gone, buried under tons of rock and earth, but the forest thrived, growing with unusual vitality. Where the main street had been, wildflowers bloomed in patterns that might have been random or might have spelled out messages for those who knew how to read them. She found Eric at the edge of what had been the grove, now indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. He came here monthly, he said, not to grieve, but to remember. Do you ever regret learning the truth? He asked. Liv considered the question, thinking of all the impossible things she'd witnessed, all the rational explanations she'd had to abandon. No, she said finally. I regret that it took a crisis to teach us what indigenous peoples always knew, that we're not separate from nature but part of it. The choosing was always a symptom of that forgotten knowledge, an attempt to bridge a gap that shouldn't exist. And now we know better, or at least some of us do. The question is whether we can spread that knowing fast enough to prevent more places from facing Elvestad's fate. They stood in silence, listening to the forest. If you knew how to hear it, really hear it, you could still sense the chosen ones, not as individual presences, but as part of the vast, interconnected web of life. Maya, Astrid, and all the others who had offered themselves to maintain a balance that should never have needed such sacrifice. As they prepared to leave, a young deer emerged from the trees, watching them with unusual boldness. Around its neck, barely visible, was a pattern in its fur that looked almost like the necklace Astrid used to wear. It studied them for a moment, then bounded away, leaving only questions in its wake. The mystery continues, Eric said, almost smiling. Good, Liv replied. The day we think we have all the answers is the day we stop learning. They drove away from the buried town, carrying its secrets and wisdom with them. Behind them, the forest grew over the ruins of human ambition, not as conquest, but as integration. The choosing had ended, but something new had begun, something that didn't require sacrifice but understanding. Not bridges, but recognition that there had never been two sides to bridge. The truth, Liv had learned, wasn't always about facts you could prove in court. Sometimes it was about stories that changed how you saw the world, mysteries that taught you more in their unsolvability than any clear answer ever could. Elvestad was gone, but its final gift lived on in those who had witnessed its transformation. A reminder that even the strangest disappearances could illuminate the deepest truths about what it means to be human in a more than human world.